This is Hannah. This is Bailey. Welcome to the Motocross Boats!
Hello, this is Tony Blazer, back with another video for the Motocross Vault. And what I'm going to cover in this one is the history of Honda's two-stroke mini bikes. It's going to cover both the CR80 and CR85R. The original CR80R was introduced in 1980. Honda was pretty late to this game. By that point, Yamaha and Suzuki had already been producing two-stroke mini bikes for several years. Before that, Honda actually relied on the four-stroke, the XR75, to be their main racing machine. Early on, this had been a pretty competitive machine when it was up against some pretty minor competition. But once Yamaha and Suzuki got serious about 80 class racing, the XR quickly became more of a play bike. It continued to be made for many years, but it was really not much of a viable motocross machine by the time they introduced the CR in 1980. Honda was also the first one to get out of the two-stroke mini bike game. In 2007, when they brought out the CRF150R, they effectively shut down the CR85 program. Thankfully, though, Honda's been the only one that's done this. The other manufacturers have kept making two-strokes. Didn't buy into the AT two-stroke hysteria, so you can still get a Kawasaki and Husqvarna and KTM and all the other 80s now. Over the years, Honda has had mixed success in the 80 class. The early ones weren't great. They had some great bikes in the late 80s, and then they kind of let the march of time go and didn't update the bike and came out with a pretty strong one a few years later. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go year by year, give you a little bit of information on each one, talk about whether it was good or bad, and hope you find this thing interesting. If you do, if you could share it on social media, I'd really appreciate it. Tell your friends. It helps the channel grow for sure. Like and ding that little bell, subscribe. I'd really appreciate that as well. And if you like this, feel free to leave me a comment if you want to hear something else about another machine we're going to cover. So here it is, the history of Honda's CR80 and 85R. As I said in the opening, Honda's initial plan for the 80 class was to have a four-stroke provide the power for their mini racer. Now, Honda at this point in the early 70s was still considered a four-stroke company, and this was actually very odd when you consider all the other Japanese brands mainly built two-strokes. All their street bikes were two-strokes, their off-road bikes were two-strokes. The two-strokes were simpler to build, easier to maintain, although they typically required a little more maintenance, regular maintenance. But Honda had stuck steadfast to four-strokes. Honda was a four-stroke company. So when they introduced their first mini bike in 1972 as a 73 model, the XR75 was a little single-cylinder four-stroke here. Now this was Honda's first off-road racer. It actually predates the CR250M Elsinore by a few months. And this bike was pretty revolutionary at the time. It had a fit and finish that was far above what you would have found in most mini bike offerings at the time. A lot of people were racing mini bikes that were made from a kind of a Frankenstein combination of different frames, different motors. They kind of made them yourself. Or you had some other mini bikes that had pre-built but were of dubious performance. Weren't really up to snuff if you were going to be a very fast kid. The XR80 though, the XR75 here was a pretty potent machine for its time out of the box. It had good suspension. The motor was mellow but had a lot of hop-up potential and incredibly rugged and reliable. You'll see that Honda used this motor for almost 50 years here. It's basically the same guys. Great little engine. And with some modification, it was pretty competitive. Jeff Ward famously raced an XR75 here in the mid-70s and put it on a lot of the two-strokes for many years there. Now, eventually, both Yamaha and Suzuki got serious about the 80 class and came out with some high-performance 80 machines of their own, and that quickly kind of put the XR on the back burner. And by 1979, the XR was looking mostly to be competitive in terms of a play bike. It wasn't really considered much of a motocross racer at this point, so Honda knew they were going to have to do something if they were going to keep kids who wanted to actually race riding red. For 1980, Honda introduced an all-new machine, the CR80R Elsinore. Now, the new Elsinore looked very similar to the CR250 and CR125, which were dual shocks at this time, still air-cooled. The new motor was a two-stroke, pumping out 79.7 cc's, that used a 26mm Keihin carburetor, and according to Honda, it pumped out 16.5 horsepower. Now, this is probably a bit exaggerated, as most of the brochure amounts are, but if it's anywhere close to that, that's pretty good delivery for a single 80cc two-stroke at the time. Now, it ran completely different than the XR, where the XR was like slow, well, relatively slow, mellow, really easy to ride. The new CR had a really explosive delivery. It did have a reed valve, had a close ratio 6-speed gearbox, manual clutch. The bike was really aimed squarely at racers, not play riders like the XR. So if somebody bought one of these CRs thinking they were going to ride an XR, they were going to be pretty shocked there. Now, in terms of performance, the CR80 was very much like its larger siblings at the time, and that meant it was very fast, but not very well suspended. These CRs in the late 70s, they were rockets. The CR250 in particular, I had a 78. It was a really fast bike, but it had pretty crappy suspension from the factory, and the 80 wasn't much different. The bike did have some pretty trick shocks on it. It had remote reservoirs on the dual shocks in the back. They looked very similar to what you would have found on the bigger bikes, but they didn't work very well. They really, if you were to ride the bike very hard with the stock suspension, you were going to bottom it out pretty easily. The bike could be kind of a handful with the stock suspension. It was really, like I said, not the best handling machine, mainly due to the poor suspension on it. There were, pretty easy fixes. If you went with aftermarket shocks or something, the bike had plenty of performance if you got the suspension suited and sorted out. But this initial offering, wasn't much of a performer out of the box unless you got the suspension fixed. These days, a 80cc machine may go a decade or more before getting a major update, but for 1981, Honda really put a lot of R&D into the CR80 after only 1 year on the market. The new bike had all new suspension for 81 that offered more travel. In 1980, the forks had a measly 6.7 inches of travel up front and 6.3 in the rear. For 1981, they upped that to 8.5 inches up front and 7.7 in the rear. Which is a pretty substantial improvement on a little bike like this. It added up to a 0.2 increase in seat height, which actually isn't much considering how much travel you picked up. The swing arm was longer. It was stronger as well. They changed the porting of the motor. It was up slightly in terms of displacement to a full 80cc, and Honda claimed it had a little over a 1.5 horsepower increase. The most important thing, though, was the power band was better for 1981. In 1980, the bike had been very strong, but it had no low end, hit really hard in the mid-range, and pulled on top. It was kind of a handful, especially for little kids. With the short suspension that didn't dampen very well and the hard-hitting power, the bike was a real tough machine to control. But for 1980, they beefed up for 81, they beefed up the low end, dialed in the suspension a little bit, and the bike was a much more competitive machine. It still wasn't like a world beater by any means, but for 81, it might have been the best bike in the CR lineup. The other 81s were not very good this year. This was the first year for liquid cooling and the monoshock on the full-size bikes, and infamously the first year for the CR450, which is notorious for being terrible. But this 1981 CR80 was a substantial improvement in most every way over the outgoing 80 model. So even though this bike looks very similar, if you look at the 80 and 81, they look very similar except for the decals. The 81 is substantially different and much better machine overall. For 1982, Honda was back with another all-new 80cc machine. The new CR80R featured a scaled-down version of the new ProLink rear suspension. Now, in 81, the full-size CRs had got the single-shock suspension treatment, so for 82, it made its way down to the 80cc class. This included a Showa shock with a remote reservoir and adjustments for compression damping only. There was no adjustment for rebound. The forks were new. They were 31 millimeters. Those were up for our 1982. They also offered slightly more travel for 82 as well. The motor was largely the same in terms of overall size and internal displacement, but there was new porting, new expansion chamber, new ignition. Basically, the whole power profile was new for 1982 in spite of using the same basic mechanicals as the year before. The reed valve was a four-pedal design. It was also a little larger for 82, and the carburetor was also slightly larger for 82. Now, on the track itself, the new ProLink suspension was much better than the dual shocks on the 80 and 81, which had not ever been great. A lot of riders thought it was kind of stiff, though, particularly compared to the excellent full floater rear suspension on the RM. It was rated probably at the bottom of the pack in terms of actual performance. Both the Yamaha monoshock and the Suzuki RMs full floater were rated above it in terms of performance. The new forks were better, but again, not the best in the class. The motor itself was a little more broad. In 81, like as I said earlier, they focused the power more towards low end after the 80 model had been real soft in this department. And a lot of people thought maybe the motor in 81 was a little too focused towards low to mid, too much of a novice motor. So for 82, they brought the power band up a little bit higher into the RPM range, so it still had a good solid low end chunk, but it pulled a little farther. Again, not the best in the class. At this point, the Kawasaki KX80 was by far the most powerful bike in the class and had the best motor. So it was a better bike, certainly better for people who are a little bit faster. Guys like a Mouse McCoy here, or a Mike Healy, or somebody riding the bike is going to like the 82 model better than the 81, but again, not the best bike in the class. It's definitely some solid improvements for 1982, but the CR still had a little ways to go to run with the best bikes in the class. For 1983, Honda pulled out all the stops with their third redesign of the CR80 in 3 years. The all-new 83 model had totally new bodywork, a change in colors. You can see here they went to the flash red, which I always love, which is more of an orangish red, pretty much my favorite color combo of all time. This looked actually very similar to the 82 Works Hondas, which had this exact same color combo, the blue seat and the orangish red color. Big changes for this year are in the motor department. The engine actually maintained the same basic internal dimensions. It had a 49.5 millimeter by 41.4 millimeter bore and stroke, and a 79cc displacement. This was the same as it had in 82, but the new motor did feature all new porting. It switched from a side port to a center port exhaust, and that was to improve the flow characteristics out of the exhaust. But the biggest change was the switch to liquid cooling. The new motor had an all new look and appeared to be literally half the size of the 82 model. Now, the fuel delivery was handled by a new 26mm Kaheen round slide carburetor. It had a set of fiber reeds and an all-new airbox. The airbox was larger for 83 and repositioned from the side of the motorcycle to just below the seat, which was just like it was on the full-size CRs at the time. Now, this motor was a little higher compression. The change to liquid cooling allowed them to safely bump up the compression. It also allowed them to run tighter tolerances in the engine because it would have a more uniform heat profile. The problem with air cooling is, obviously, as the motor got hot, you're going to lose a little power. You had to take into account the expansion that was going to come from the engine getting hotter, especially on an 80 where you're running the crap out of it all the time. So for 1983, they bumped up the compression ratio from 6.5 to 1 to 7.6. It was still a 6-speed manual with a manual clutch, but there were new ratios installed to better work with the redesigned engine's power characteristics. There was a new clutch also installed, and the clutch had tougher plates and revised springs to handle the 83 bike's improved power output. Honda claimed the 83 put out 20 horsepower on the dyno. And again, this is probably a little bit more than it probably actually put out, but all these brochures always have a little bit of leeway there. Now on the track, the new 83 CR80R produced a strong low to mid surge and not much else. It ran a lot like the 81 model had, where it was really torquey, good pickup for an 80. Of course, it's not like an XR or a CR500 or something. It wasn't going to pull your arms out of your sockets, but for an 80 it was very torquey, but it didn't pull very far on top. Now, very similar to, like I said, in the 81, 82, this made the bike really popular with novices who liked the strong low to mid power, but experts like Mike Healy here weren't going to be as satisfied with the stock power. It really wasn't the most powerful bike in the class. Like, again, the KX80 had the most power, the best suspension, the roomiest ergonomics this year. It really was hard to beat the Kawasaki, and this is really where Kawasaki started kind of taking the lead in the in these 82, 83 models. They started really taking it to the others, and Kawasaki never really had a whole lot of success on the big bikes, but they started dominating the mini class in the early 80s here, and they were the bike to beat at this time overall. Remarkably, after serving up an all-new bike for 1983, Honda was back at it a year later in 84 with another all-new CR80R. Pretty hard to imagine these days the manufacturers were revising their 80s at this rate. Like I said, today you're going to see some 80s are like 20, 30 years old. An RM80, gosh darn it, it probably goes back basic motor and stuff back to like 89, and it's still the same bike now. It's had a few updates over the years, but in the early 80s you're going to see some pretty radical redesigns. In 83, almost all the 80s were all new. Crazy days. For 84 here, though, the CR was back with an all-new chassis, larger forks. They were up to 33 millimeters in the front, punching out a full 9.4 inches of travel. Out back, the ProLink was new ratios, up to 10 inches of travel in the back. The engine was all new this year. It was up to 80 cc's and had a all-new internal design that incorporated a power valve for the first time. Now, I use that term lightly because when you think of a power valve now, most of the bikes would have a variable exhaust port and a combination of an exhaust resonance chamber. But this early version, Yamaha was the only one using the variable actual exhaust port at this time in terms of changing the port timing. This first version that Honda used, the ATAC, it actually just had a little sub-chamber here tacked onto the exhaust valve, and what it was designed to do was to vary the head pipe volume of the motorcycle, essentially giving you a torque pipe at low RPMs, then it would close off and give you like a rev pipe, like having two different pipes in one. It was a very interesting idea. Worked better on some bikes than others. It didn't really come together too great in this CR80 in 1984. The power band itself was still a low to mid kind of style, very similar to 1983 and earlier. It actually seemed to have a little less low end, though. The ATAC was designed to beef that up, but it seemed most of the test riders seemed to think the 84 actually had a little less grunt than 83. It still did not have phenomenal top end, though. For fast guys, thought the bike was just not quite up to snuff in that regard. The power band was certainly behind the Yamaha, which would leave it for dead, and the Kawasaki as well. The overall bike, though, was well regarded. It was in motocross action, did the shootout here with all the 80s. It finished second behind the Kawasaki. The Kawasaki actually had a worse rated suspension in 1984, but the motor was so omnipotent over the others, it was just not. Nobody was able to overcome that advantage Kawasaki had at the time. The Honda's forks worked decently. The ProLink was okay. The Kawasaki, of course, had a better front brake. It actually had a disc in 1984, which is pretty remarkable. They were always ahead of the times on that stuff. The bike itself, like I said, was a little bit improved in some ways. The ergonomics, I said, were better. The overall chassis worked pretty well, but the main problem was the motor just wasn't up to snuff to running with the best bikes in the class this year. Another year and another all-new CR80R. The 1985 season brought with it one of my favorite designs in terms of appearance. I loved all the 85s in this year. Great-looking machines overall. This bodywork is very clean, handsome machine for sure. Performance-wise, the bike was, again, totally redesigned. The frame was all new. It featured a new box section down tube to increase rigidity, give a better handling response. The motor was new, had a little bit larger displacement. It was up to 83 cc's. The compression ratio was 8.2 to 1 this year. Had a larger 28 millimeter carburetor. The ignition was new, still used a 6-speed close ratio transmission and a manual clutch. The forks were all new this year. They put out 10.2 inches of travel. Out back, the ProLink's rear suspension was redesigned as well. Had an all-new ratio. Had a Kiaba shock, offering 10.6 inches of travel. The motor continued to use the ATAC system, the automatic torque amplification chamber. Again, did not yield very much in terms of actual performance gains. In spite of having this little bit of high-tech trickery, the new CR was basically smoked by the KX80. In fairness, all the other 80s were smoked by the KX80 again this year. Kawasaki had the 80 class on lockdown in this era from like about 82 until 86 or so. In spite of having an all-new design, this bike, it just wasn't up to taking the the 80cc title this year. The Kawasaki, again, had probably suspension that wasn't as good as some of the competition, including the CR, although the CR suspension wasn't loved this year either. But just the motor in the 80 class was just such an advantage. The bike handled well. Basically, if you were fast and you could get the motor up to snuff, it was one of the best bikes. But out of the box, it was just too underpowered to be any kind of real threat to the omnipotent Kawasaki. For 1986, Honda was back with a lineup of all new machines that looked very similar to 85, but eclipsed the outgoing models in pretty much every category. These bikes were phenomenal from the 80 all the way up to the 500 this year in 86. Really, maybe Honda's best year ever in terms of overall domination of every class. It was really a fantastic year to be riding red. In the case of the CR80, it got an all-new motor this year. The motor itself was completely redesigned. It got rid of the ATAC system, went back to a conventional unencumbered exhaust on this, and it turned out to be a huge improvement. Amazingly, this motor would, in more or less with some minor changes, power the CR80 for the next like 20 years. Really, really potent motor for its time particularly. This motor was just the motor of doom in 1986. It was fairly torquey down low for an 80. Certainly for this time, it was considered strong down low. Before 89, when Suzuki finally put a power valve in their 80, this was probably the strongest motor in the class by far. In the mid-range, it came on with a huge burst of power and just screamed to the moon. And if you've ever ridden any of these 80s, man, these CRs, they are just rocket ships. Even with a full-size adult on board, they're just blazing fast. On the dyno, the 86 model here put out a full 4 horsepower more than 85, which when you consider when on Dirt Rider's dyno, the stock 85 only put out like 14.3 horsepower. To jump up 18 is a huge increase. Go up to 18. It was really, really a awesome change for 86 in terms of the power characteristics of the motor. The frame was new this year. They changed the geometry slightly, gave a little more comfort to the ergos. The suspension was still a 33mm fork, so that was kind of a downer. Even in 1986, that was getting to be a little bit small for the class standard. Rear suspension had some minor updates. Really, the main thing for 1986 was the motor. They did also add a front disc brake for the first time, which is definitely something you want to have when you have a bike this fast. Now, in 86, Kawasaki also was back, but they kind of stumbled after dominating the class for many years. They changed the power characteristics on the KX80 this year, and it went with much more of a top-end focused expert-style motor, and most of the magazines didn't really care for it, thought it was much harder to ride, and pretty much everybody picked the CR as the best bike this year. The suspension, as I said, wasn't great. It continued to be really too soft. The motor had a lot more performance than the suspension could handle. If you were a fast kid or somebody's going to be airing this thing out, you're going to bottom it at both ends. It really needed a little bit of work. There was a lot of fork flex. Again, if you're really fast and you're doing major sky shots on it, you're going to get some fork flex there on the landings and bottom them out pretty easily. That part was really the only chink in the armor, though. The rest of the bike handled really well, turned really well. Just a phenomenal motorcycle here in 86. They went with the only problems. The motor had some issues. On these CR80s, typically Hondas tend to last really long in general, but the 80s, this motor required a fair amount of upkeep. If you let it go very long without a rebuild, it was going to show. It went to a single ring piston this year, and the cylinder, this is the first year for Nikasil coating, which is like a coating on the cylinder that's very hard, has great heat disposition characteristics, and is very light, but you can't bore it. This was the first year where you couldn't, if you seized your CR, you had to buy a new cylinder. You couldn't just bore it over like you could in the past. So that was a little bit of a downer, but overall, a phenomenal year for Honda and one of the best years for the CR80. After 1986, one thing you're going to notice here is the pace of innovation in the 80cc class kind of slows down a bit. Early on in the 80s, as you see, all the manufacturers were revving their bikes every year, at the worst every other year. It was pretty amazing. And this is the 80 class. We're not talking about the Premier CR250 or the CR125 or anything. You're talking about the 80s, the minis, which, like I said, currently get completely ignored for the most part. This 87 bike is very similar to the 86. They did have some important updates. They did address one of the major complaints in 86, which was the flexi forks. So for 87, they bolted on a set of 35mm forks in the front. That definitely helped with the handling, made the front end more precise, and stopped that deflecting and flexing you got under hard hits and under high stress. They made some subtle changes in the engine. There was a new piston ring designed to seal better, new porting. They enlarged the reed valve slightly, and they put on an all-new exhaust pipe. Now, what that was designed to do is kind of broaden the power. In 86, it did have an excellent motor, as I said, but some people were looking for maybe a little bit more, a little bit broader power. Like I said, it was kind of soft down low or whatever. So for 87, they were trying to widen the power band a little bit. I mean, it is an 80. You don't expect it to be a tractor or anything, but anything that can help Junior go a little faster is good. Other than that, it was largely unchanged. The styling is very similar to 86, as you can see. Not a whole lot of difference there. The bike itself was still, by most standards, the best bike in the class. The motor was excellent, maybe even a little bit better than 86, but very similar. The new forks were better. The suspension was actually better. It wasn't the best suspension package in the class. The RM with its full floater rear and forks were considered the best overall suspension, but the RM didn't have as good of a total power package in some ways as the Honda. The mid-range wasn't quite as strong, so most people picked the Honda over it, but it was a pretty close battle that year. The RM was very good in 1987. The Kawasaki continued to have some issues with being difficult to ride, lack of bottom end power, and what have you. And the Yamaha was clearly aimed at kids at this point. The YZ80 was the smallest bike, had a narrow power band, old-fashioned suspension. Considering future Damon Bradshaw is probably going to need to do a lot of work to the YZ80 to get it up to speed this year. So for most people who were above like a complete novice, the CR was the bike to buy in 1987. For 1988, by far the biggest change was the appearance of the CRs. All the 88 CRs had an all-new look with a new blood red color scheme. At the time, I wasn't a big fan of this change. I loved the orange, flash red color, but this new deep red, actually in hindsight, looks awesome. I love the 88 and 89s with this color combo. Really good looking machines. The engines, you'll notice, have a silver cylinder. They changed that as well. Went with an unpainted look, which was kind of like, gave it that aftermarket hopped up look. A lot of times in the old days, you'd send your cylinder out and come back unpainted, and kind of gave it that sweet aftermarket look. The bodywork on the 88 CR80 was all new as well. The basic bike was really largely unchanged. The only main significant changes were a new damping system in the forks. They went to a travel sensitive compression dampening, which was similar to what Kayaba was using on its damper rod forks. They had a TVC, which they called travel control valve. It was designed to give a little better control through the stroke. They changed some bearings and bushings in the shock mounts and linkage pivots to work a little smoother. Minor stuff. Airbox got a new air filter. The remove and replacement was a little bit easier for 88. The plastic, as I said, was all new. It did get the looks of the 88 CR. You can see here the 88 CR was all new this year with some really sweet looking bodywork, and the 80 actually got a very similar look. The 125 and 500 both had to make do with 87 bodywork with just the new color combo, but the 88 80 got the all new sweet low boy look. The tank was a little lower for 1988 on the CR80. The seat was longer, went farther up the tank. Side plates were new, but mainly the appearance was by far the biggest difference. The basic mechanicals of the bike really were largely unchanged. The engine was completely the same except for a little bit longer silencer. The silencer continued to be a pretty crappy steel, unrebuildable thing, and it was by far the most obnoxious silencer out there. It was really a loud machine. That was one thing that people knocked it for at the time. It was super powerful, but really ratty sounding and annoying, especially if you didn't put an aftermarket one after the packing got blown out. Now the bike itself continued to be one of the fastest in the class. It had plenty of power. As I said, it was a really strong in the mid-range and on up. Really powerful. Low end was decent for an 80. At the time this was still considered a very broad engine for its time, but by any kind of modern standards, it really didn't have a whole lot of low end. It was really a mid-range on up motor. Once it hit the power band, though, it really took off like a rocket. It was still the fastest motor in the class in 1988. The new forks turned out to be mediocre, and continuing a succession of mediocre suspension on Honda's 80s. The forks were much softer than the shock, and that caused some problems. If you were very fast or you're going to hit things very hard, you're going to bottom out the forks, and it gave it kind of a stink bug feel from the factory there. The shock was a little better, still not great. Neither end was as good as what you had on the RM this year. Most of the magazines basically rated the CR as the best engine in the class, but the suspension held it back. The brakes were decent. The front disc was pretty strong. The rear drum, though, was a bummer. The Kawasaki by this point had moved over onto a disc, and the Honda drum brake, while it worked decently enough, it wore very quickly, and it was only moderately powerful. So the bike had some great points. The motor by far was the best point. The handling was very good as well. Once you got the suspension settled up, the bike handled real well. It was a great turning machine. It was a little busy though if you had the stock forks in there and the thing was kind of diving all the time, so it was best to get the suspension dialed a little bit. Once you did that, it was by most people's standard probably the second best 80 in 1988. After bolting on all new bodywork in 1988, the only changes made for 1989 was a new graphic package. I do love these graphics, the 89 CR on the seat and the logo on the tank. These are actually my favorite Honda graphics of all time. They're real clean. Love the look of everything. Love the red Pro Link on the swing arm. It kind of sucks they got away from putting the cool names of the rear suspension designs on the bikes in the 90s. But in fact, I think this is the last year where it actually says Pro Link on the bikes, on the CRs. But overall, this bike was exactly the same as it was the year before. That meant it was rocket fast, but also pretty poorly suspended. Honda, I guess, was confident to sit on their laurels. Like I said, the 80cc development was starting to slow down at this point. You'd still get a few revs every couple of years, but they were staggered out. It certainly wasn't every year or every other year. Really, the big news for 1989 was the all-new motor in the RM80. This really rocketed the RM to the front of the class. This was the first RM80 that offered their new power valve system. It really broadened the power hugely on the RM, made it the most flexible motor in the class by far. It gave it great torque, great low end, something the CR didn't really have. The CR continued to be fast, but it was a mid and up motor. Once it hit the power band, it really would shoot out from under you, as you can see here. The bike was very potent, but it wasn't nearly as easy to ride as the Suzuki. The Suzuki had way better suspension this year. Really, in 89, there really wasn't any other bike that was even close to the RM. It offered a far broader power band and a really much easier to ride motor than pretty much any 80 in the class at the time. And really, its only drawback was its looks. It looked like it was still stuck in 1983. Even in 1989, that thing looked goofy and kind of out of date. And when you look at the 250 and the 125 this year and how great they looked, it's kind of amazing how out of step this thing was. And the fact that they basically didn't do much to improve it for another decade is pretty sad. But as I said, things moved slowly in the 80 class, and at least Suzuki got it right out of the gate, so it stayed competitive for quite a while. For 1990, the CR80 was back with bold new graphics and nothing else. The bike was completely the same as it was in 89. The new look did have a very different appearance, though. This, as you can see, went back to the flash red, my favorite of the color combos. I love the 90 CR. I actually had 125, 250, and 500 this year. I love the look of it overall. The 80, like I said, it still has the old bodywork on it, so it doesn't change a whole lot. I do, like I said, I do dig the graphics and stuff. It's a good-looking motorcycle overall. It because obviously it had not changed, it didn't fare any better in the shootout. Really, none of the bikes were greatly changed for 1990. All the 80s were pretty much the same as they had been in 89, so the RM was still the best machine in the class. It would have to wait a year or two, I think, more until Kawasaki would rev theirs for any of the other 80s to catch up. In 1991, the entire Honda lineup got some very bold new graphics. This was a look that I really hated in 91. You'll hear this again from me. I'm always hesitant to change. Whenever they make some radical departure, I'm usually not a huge fan. Interestingly, the bike was still the flash red. I like the orangey red, but they went with a white shroud this year and these kind of crazy CR graphics. Again, didn't like it. Didn't like the tiger stripe too much at the time, but now it's kind of cool. It looks a little different on the CR80 because it only has a shroud on one side here, so I actually think the graphics don't work quite as well on the tank side as they do on the shroud side, but overall, kind of an iconic 90s look now. Other than that, the CR80 was completely the exact same bike it was in 1990. They did not make a single change other than the BNG, bold new graphic treatment, for 91. For 1992, Honda had another radical change in appearance in store. This one probably, in fact, certainly more bold than 91. They went with a all-new neon pinkish red look they called Nuclear Red. Now, in photos, this looks pretty red. Like I said, when you scan it in, and I take these photos and scan them, it comes across as being pretty red, but in reality, this color was much more like almost like a translucent pink. If you had this bike out in the sun, it actually, some of the light showed through the plastic, and it looked kind of salmon-y colored. And as soon as the light hit it for very long, it started to fade pretty quickly. This early design Again, I hate it. First time I went into my local Honda store, which was Dutros Honda in '92, I was like, what in the Sam hell are they thinking? Now, people love this color combo now, and actually it got a lot better because this first year in '92, it's kind of, like I said, kind of a salmony pink color. It actually changed a little bit in '93, and then '94 again they added a little bit more of the red each year. So this '92 one is by far the most pink of any of them. Like I said, you'd had to have seen one in person probably to kind of understand, because the color doesn't translate so well in these photos. Now in terms of performance, the CR80 did pick up a couple of important updates for '92. The basic motor cycle was the same. The chassis, the motor, all that stayed the same, but they did add a rear disc brake. So it finally was up to speed with the other. The KX80 and the RM80 at this point also had disc brakes. So that was a welcome addition on a bike that had so much power. And they also revised the suspension setting. It had the same fork and shock combination it had for basically the last 6 years, but they revised the settings, finally put stiffer springs in them, and updated the damping to better handle the performance of the bike. Before, like I said, it was way undersprung and underdamped, and for '92 the suspension performance was much improved. The motor, as I said, was basically exactly the same as it had been more or less since 1987. In spite of this, the CR still had one of the most powerful power packages in the class. It did not have the broad power still of the RM, but it had a very potent mid-range that put it at the front in terms of outright power. It was certainly much more difficult to ride, but if you were just looking for maximum speed, the CR was still very competitive. Really, in the overall standings that year, it came down to basically the RM or the KX were considered by most people to be the best bike. The KX had got an all-new perimeter frame in 1991, and it was a very solid chassis, certainly much more advanced than the chassis on any of the other bikes at this point. Had large, beefy forks. The only kind of drawback on this bike was the motor was a little bit pipey and difficult to ride, very similar to the Honda, but just not with as much power. The RM had a better engine, but the chassis was a little bit old. The suspension was still very good, though. In terms of the Yamaha, this is the last year for the outgoing YZ80 design, which had come out in 1986. Very much like the CR, it was pretty ancient at this point. Still had steel silencer, old school, everything. It wasn't a world beater in 1986, so by 1992 you can imagine that really only little kids or people whose father owned a Yamaha shop were probably riding the YZ, so it was due for a total redesign. At least the CR was fairly competitive in spite of the fact that it was an old design, maybe because they got the bike so right originally. It held on to its competitiveness far longer than you probably would have expected. For '93, the CR80 was back with some new graphics and a slightly redder shade of plastic. The color is a little bit different if you saw it in person. It's a little deeper. And then again in '94, they updated the red again to make it a little more close to what you would think of as a typical Honda red. These graphics, as you can see, the graphics to me look a little better on the shroud side. It always looked weird because with these white tanks, when they would go put the graphics on this side, they had to contrast it where the graphics would be offset with white, kind of as an outline. They would outline it with red. I always thought it looked kind of weird, but the bike itself was completely unchanged, no difference. Kind of stuck in a time warp at this point. Still using a old school steel unrebuildable silencer. Weird little things like the perches were one piece. You had to take the grip off to take the clutch perch off. The clutch was not removable. The clutch cover is not removable. The bike was clearly stuck in 1986 in a lot of ways, and the class was moving on at this pace at this point. Now, the really only bike of note in the 80 class in 1993 was the all-new YZ80. Yamaha completely redesigned it this year. Beautiful machine, nicely done, new frame, chassis, everything. Interestingly, it didn't kind of dominate the standings this year, in spite of having an all-new chassis with, a bigger overall layout. The ergonomics were improved. The suspension was excellent. The motor continued to be, a little bit mediocre. It was narrow. The power band was narrower than like what you would have found on the RM, and it actually wasn't any faster than what was on the CR in terms of outright power. Basically it was a chassis that was excellent with still had the notchy transmission that Yamahas are kind of known for in this era. So it took a few years for everything else to get sorted out on that. But this first 93 model was better than the 92 in every way for sure, but still not quite the best bike in the class at this point. Alright, we're going to move quickly here through 1994 and 1995 because honestly there's not much to say. The 94 and 95 bikes are identical with the exception of an all-new tire in 94. It got a Dunlop K695, which was the ubiquitous OEM tire of the time. Good tire, great tire. I ran it on mini bikes, and it was kind of the go-to tire for many years. 94 here gets an updated graphic. I will say I really like this 94 graphic. Of this 92 to 94 era, this is my favorite. I actually ended up putting this on my 1990 CR. At one point I switched out to white plastic on it and stuff, and put the 94 graphic on mine. I thought it was by far the best looking of that couple of years there without the Honda wings on them. For 95 we get the very questionable purple seat. Never a huge fan of this. It's back then, particularly, I absolutely hated it. I thought this thing looked like a clown show. I know a lot of people dig it now. I like it now for the fact that it's just so damn crazy. I don't know what the hell Honda and everybody was smoking with the purple, but in any case, in 95 they went purple-tastic here, and the 95 certainly is unique, but I wouldn't call it pretty. So other than that, it's basically the exact same bike it had been since 92. Alright, for 1996, the CR80 was the big news in the 80cc class. The CR got its first major redesign probably since 1986 was the last time when they came out with the all-new non-power valve, non-ATAC motor. The 96 model here was completely new from the ground up. Really the only thing they didn't change was the motor. Inside the motor, internally, they got some new stuff in the transmission. They redesigned the shift drum, then the ratchet paw and plunger to give it a little smoother shift action. Interesting because the CR already had the smoothest shifting transmission already, so this stuff was, I guess, just icing on the cake for the power plant. It still continued not to have a power valve. It didn't get the HPP system of the CR125 or the different power valve system used on the 250. So it was still a cylinder read. Interesting as well. It was not case read. So unlike the CR80, didn't get that either. So they were able to get really strong competitive power out of this kind of old school motor. Really, the engine is kind of the same design you would have seen on a 1981 CR. Really is not much different than that. They just did a good job with the porting and everything and got great power out of the engine. Now, the rest of the bike was completely new. The frame was all new. This is the first year they added a fully removable subframe. I'm sure that was great for mini dads everywhere had to work on these things. They got rid of the cheesy steel swing arm, the steel triple clamps. All that stuff was finally alloy. Got rid of the absurd 1970s style solid clutch perch and brake lever, so you could finally remove that. Actually had split perches. Really kind of brought the bike up to modern standards in terms of the switch gear and stuff. The disc brake was larger. It was 220 millimeters for 1996. That's larger. The forks themselves are now an inverted design. They used a 37 millimeter Shawa cartridge fork, so this all of a sudden leapfrogged this fork to probably the most advanced in the class. It had compression and rebound damping, fully adjustable. They got rid of the kind of cheeseball 1983 style remote reservoir shock and came with a full up-to-date piggyback shock with larger shock body and more internal volume. The layout was all new. It was really flat, slim, excellent layout, way more than the old school CR was. All that stuff was getting pretty cheesy and old school at this point. The new engine was painted silver, brought it up to the looks with the new bikes. In addition to all this stuff, they added a larger bike. A CR80R Expert was new in 1996. Now, the Expert was designed to race in the Super Mini class. At this point, Kawasaki was the only manufacturer building a bike specifically for the Super Mini class. In 96, this was a KX100. So the CR did give up some displacement. That gave it a little bit of a disadvantage in terms of the power band. The 100 definitely had more torque than the CR80. The CR80 was plenty powerful, but again, this engine was not known for its super awesome low-end response, so it was kind of an expert-oriented engine. And then when you went up against the KX100, which had, a 18, 19 cc advantage on it, it made it even more of a disadvantage there for the CR80 Expert. But the chassis certainly was there if you wanted to beef up the motor. The bike this year was considered excellent. It was either 1 or 1A depending on what it was up against. The motor, again, was really the only drawback. The engine was a little bit peaky still. If you were an expert, it was the best bike to buy. If you were slower, the broader, easier to ride RM80 still was a viable option in spite of its ancient 1983 looking bodywork. But anyways, this was a huge step forward for the CR80 for sure. After the complete redesign of 1996, Honda was content to rest on its laurels in 97 and 1998. The only real significant difference is the switch to the white rear fender here for 97. I will say that I love the 97 graphics. All the 97 CRs look great with this look. I love the return of the iconic Honda wing. Huge fan of the Honda wing. I don't think it should ever be missing from the graphics. And I really like the looks of the bike this year. The CR on the seat and the yellow wing on the tank and stuff is a sweet look overall. And the color scheme is really cool. The 98, the switch to the black seat, I don't really love it as well. It's still a good looking motorcycle. Still has the yellow wing like I like. So really the only difference between these two bikes is graphics. I will say I kind of prefer the white fender to this look. So the black seat, the red fender, not as handsome to me as 97. 97 is my favorite, I think, of these. But mechanically, performance-wise, everything else is totally identical between these 2 years. After 2 years of bold new graphics, the CR80R was back for 1999 with a surprising list of improvements and changes. The chassis was completely redesigned for 99, even though the bike looks very similar to the outside. If you looked at it, it looks the same, but the frame is all new. It was 20% stiffer. The tubing in the frame itself was larger and also had a larger set of cross members. And they also strengthened and stiffened the plating and also the gusseting of the welds. The wheelbase was shorter as well. It was 0.08 inches shorter, and they repositioned the steering head 10 millimeters back and 10 millimeters down to increase steering precision. Both the front and rear suspension were revalved, and the shock itself was a little bit shorter, and they went by 1 millimeter. So they were really, in spite of the fact that the bike looks very similar to 1998, really handled differently. The motor was completely the same. Again, this is still using basically the 86 motor. Honda was getting their money out of the dies on that thing for sure. After its major chassis redesign in 1999, the CR80 was back in 2000 with only a graphical update. The red seat was back on the bike, which I give a massive thumbs up to. Think it looks better with this red seat for sure. And a new set of graphics were really the only change. You'll notice the plastic color is a little different. Again, Honda's always kind of fiddling with that. In 99, they had more of a deep, darker red. In 2000, they went to a slightly lighter, maybe a little more orangey color. They called Explosion Red. Like this color, good looking bike. But other than the graphics, it's completely the same machine it was in 1999. Changes for 2001 can be summed up in 3 words. Bold new graphics. Other than the change in font from the seat and the shroud, and the tank in this case in the 80, they're exactly the same. You'll notice the CR has moved from the tank to the seat, and the Honda's moved from the seat to the tank. Very clever, Honda. You almost fooled us into thinking it was a new bike, but it didn't work. More bold new graphics for 2002, although I will say these are some of my favorites. I do like the switch Honda did when they went to the Honda on the seat here and the black seat top of the cover. I'm not sure how to describe that, but I had the CRF450 this year, the first year it came out. Good looking bike. I like this wing that's kind of built into the graphic design itself. Overall, good looking graphic design, even though the bike itself was no different for this year. For 2003, Honda's small CR adopted a new look and a new name. The rechristened CR85R was really not much different in terms of actual mechanical performance than the outgoing model, but it does look much different, and it has, as I said, a new name. Now, that name came from a displacement update from 83 to 84.7 cc's. That was due to some rule changes that allowed the displacement level to go up a little bit. Now that sounds like a bigger difference than it really was, because the old bike, like I said, was 83. It wasn't an 80 in quotes. 83 was the old limit. So the bike really was not quite 2 cc's bigger, but marketing wise, just like the old Honda 480 was not a 480. The 500 was never a 500. I guess it sounded better to call it an 85. At this point, Suzuki was calling theirs an 85 and Yamaha as well. So it was kind of the trend, and it made the bike seem, like I said, newer than it really was. In addition to the the increase in displacement, the motor got a more durable transmission. They beefed up third gear slightly. It had been a kind of a fault point on some CR80s if they were ridden hard. Third gear had some issues, so they beefed it up with a little larger, thicker third gear for increased toughness. They also beefed up the frame slightly, and they changed the looks. As I said, the looks is probably the biggest difference. There was some new suspension settings for the ProLink rear and the inverted Showa forks in front, and they little stuff like they added new brake pad material. A lot of little stuff for 2003. As I said, the biggest difference is the looks. You can see the bike here Looks much more like the larger CRs. They went with a faux radiator shroud here on the right to give it as if it had a symmetrical radiator on both sides like the big bikes. It really is on this side just a tank with a cover on it, and then on the other side that has a full shroud instead of the mini shroud and the tank being exposed. So it definitely updates the looks without completely redesigning the bike. Gives it more of a big bike look, and I think by most people's standards it was definitely an improvement in the appearance of the little mini for 2003. Unfortunately for Honda two-stroke fans, this 2003 redesign would be the last major update the CR85 would receive. After this, it would be only tiny little tweaks and just some graphical updates until the final retirement of the CR85 in 2007. I wouldn't even call these bold new graphics, quite frankly. They changed the CR from yellow to silver here and then shuffled them around. I will say that I like this 04 design, maybe the best of the ones to come. These later ones not as much, but they're all very similar. The bike really didn't change until its eventual retirement. It really is kind of sad that the bike went away, and as I said, eventually it was replaced by the CRF150R, which was Honda's new four-stroke Mini. Thankfully, this has not led to a overwhelming turn to four-strokes in the Mini division, as all of us had feared it probably would at the time. I remember when the YZ250F came out, all of us thought there was a YZ150F right around the corner, but it hasn't happened, whether that's for internal political reasons or maybe some good sense in Japan, I'm not sure, but I'm glad it hasn't, because the two-stroke is a really great tool for a kid to learn the basics on, and it's way easier to fix if something goes wrong. So there's certainly a place in it in the sport. As long as the government doesn't ban the two-strokes, I think they should be available. So in any case, I hope you've enjoyed this look back at the CR80 and 85. I certainly have enjoyed putting it together. If you like this sort of thing, check out some of the others. I did a retrospective on the Z50 Mini Trail recently. I also did one on the XR, the history of the XR250 that's been very popular. I hope to do some more as we go. It takes me a while to put them together, though. So if you like it, please let me know in the comments. If you have any suggestions on other ones you'd like to see me do, please feel free to drop me a line as well. You can certainly send me a message on Instagram or Twitter. That's at Tony Blazer. That's TonyBlazer. If you'd like to support my channel, there's merchandise available, Motocross Vault t-shirts and stickers and all kind of manner of nonsense there on the description below. And again, if you like this sort of thing, like it, share it on social media. I would very much appreciate it. You can also check out my articles on pulpmx.com. I have a ton of them on there. I've covered many machines, including a very comprehensive history of Honda's motocross bikes, starting in the 1970s all the way up until the late 2000s. So it took me, good Lord, it took me over a year to put that one together. So if you like this sort of thing, check it out. I would certainly appreciate you reading it and supporting PulpMX. Helps pay my bills. So in any case, until we meet again, keep the rubber side down, and peace.